Well, hello everybody, welcome back to another week of eGroup as we're talking about our new series, our new kind of theme for 2025, risk and reward. Now you may notice that this week we've been joined by the wonderful Pastor Monica Collard. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Very good. And we're going to continue our discussion all about risk and reward. Those moments where God might be leading us in 2025 into moments where we know we've got to do something that could be a risk. But as we've said before, the wonderful thing about taking a risk that God leads us into is that there's always a reward on the way as well. So Pastor Monica, do you want to share with us a little bit about the kind of risk that you want to be talking about today?
Yes. So I feel God really wants us to take the risk of believing what he has said.
Yeah.
And for many of us, we live in a safe, secure, comfortable, predictable life, but actually that's not necessarily the kingdom way that God has for us. And I really feel like there are promises that God has given, maybe as a young child, but maybe we have just allowed that to be put on the shelf because we haven't seen it happen yet.
Yeah.
But the risk of believing what God has said, believing again, so that we can become, and just talking about Abram, we'll talk about him shortly, but he believed and then he became.
Yes.
But that was a risk. That was a risk.
And that's a really great way to see the whole area and the whole theme of risk, because in one sense you've got the idea of when God might speak to you now about leading you into a risk, and you've got the risk itself, but you've probably got that little battle beforehand which goes, was that really God? And it can be a risk, can't it, to go, okay, that was him speaking. But then also I love that thing you just shared there, that fact that actually sometimes there's things God says to us years and years and years in the past, right? And actually it's a risk, because it can take up a lot of different things, can it be? It can be a challenge sometimes to go, okay, God, you said that then. I haven't seen this thing yet, but I'm still believing in what you've said. That can be a risk in itself, right?
It can, yeah, definitely. And I think as well, I was just reading this morning, the story of the disciples when Peter went out and he was fishing, and Jesus comes along and he says, oh, Peter, all you need to do is go out into the deep and throw out your nets again. And I can imagine myself as Peter just being like, seriously, I've been fishing all night, I haven't caught anything. But Peter dared to believe what Jesus said. And then what happens? He gets the reward of taking that risk of, okay, I'm going to take you at your word. And there were so many fish came in, they had to get another boat over. They both nearly sank. And then he was just totally overawed by just you believing Jesus at his word and the reward that comes from that. Absolutely.
Because that's the funny thing with a risk, isn't it? It's not always straightforward, right?
No. And it's not often the way that you think it will be.
Yeah. If you take Jesus at his word, you know that it's a risk worth taking, right? And the reward is well worth it, isn't it?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's talk then about Abraham. Given a word by God, takes a long time for him to see kind of the reward that comes from that. But let's talk a little bit about his story.
Well, his story begins Genesis 12, where God says to him, go from your country, go from your relatives, go from your father's house, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. And often we can think, oh, the reward part sounds really good. To me, if I was Abraham, the reward part, I will make you a great nation. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, please. I will bless you. Yes, please. But the risk part was leave everything you have known up until this point. Leave your hometown, leave your country, leave your relatives, leave your father's house, like everything that brought security, comfort, the things that he was familiar with. God said to him, leave that. But he didn't really show him where to go. He says, I will show you. And it's that idea of go and I'll show. And I've come to wrestle with it. God doesn't give you many details.
Yeah.
He works on a strictly need to know basis. Like he'll tell you the details when you need them, but not before. And I think sometimes in our Western mentality, we can think of life like Google Maps. You know where you're going to go and you just want to have like something mapped out. But life doesn't work like that with God. And we see that with Abraham. He left everything. He dared to believe God. He took the risk of believing God, not knowing which way to go. But then the reward was phenomenal. He didn't even get to see it, but it just says in verse 3 of Genesis 12, it says that all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. And really he was alluding to the Messiah coming through his lineage. And that's a phenomenal promise, that it was a reward not just for Abraham but for generations that went after him. But he had the risk of daring to believe God, taking God at his word with very little detail.
Very little detail. And even on that journey, moments where like even greater risks had to be taken. I'm thinking of when God says, go and take your son up the mountain and go and kill him. Like if you've been promised the reward of you'll have many generations, well, to get rid of your son, the one that's going to be the next in line, continues to be a mad risk, but he continues to take God at his word, doesn't it? And like you said, the reward that it leads to is remarkable and it is incredible. We can take a lot, can't we? I think from that real story, and I guess many people in the Bible who took God at his word, who said, okay, God, if you've said it, I'm going to believe it. If you've said so, then I'll go. Do you think, or can you think of any kind of ways in our lives though that we can do that? Because it's easy for you and I to sit here right now and say, well, if God said it, let's just go and do it.
Yes.
To put that into practice is a risk, isn't it? It's a
really
total different thing.
It really is. And we read the Bible knowing the end from the beginning for all the stories. And I was reading as well, it's interesting. So there's an African gazelle, Sam, an animal, African gazelle, that's got the ability to jump really high and also up to distances of 30 feet. However, they've worked out how to contain it and constrain it in a zoo. And it's simply by having high walls so that it can't see where it lands. And I think we are I feel like I'm a lot like the African gazelle. Sometimes it's hard, isn't it, to take the risk of jumping or taking a step because you can't see where the end is. But I think with God, like we are never meant to live a predictable, boring life. We are always meant to be. And people think risk is reckless, but actually risk is just faith in what God has said. As a small child, you're often told, don't run across the road, don't take the risk of running in front of a train. But risk is not the opposite of safety. It's actually a mark of faith. And we know the currency of heaven is faith. And really, faith is just a step. It's not a giant leap, it's one step. But sometimes it's accompanied by the risk of feeling uncomfortable, of not knowing where the ending is, of not knowing where you're going. It's the risk of believing in people. It's the risk of believing again. Like for me this year, I've really sensed God just asking me to believe his word over promises over family and over friends. And if I look at their lives, they are far from what the promise is, but there's a risk of believing. And I think your heart is whole whenever you can believe God and take him at his word and actually go, okay, I'm going to risk this again, God. I'm going to believe, I'm going to go after, I'm going to pray. But it is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, not knowing the end, but knowing that God is with you every single step that you take. And that really is the daily challenge, I think, isn't it? It's every single day knowing, okay, I haven't seen what I'm believing for yet. The reward isn't here yet, but I'm still stepping out in the risk that God's asked me to take, or even, like we said, even believing what God said and continuing to do so, continuing to put my faith on the line to say, okay, God, if you've seen it, if you've said it, I believe one day we're going to see it. That is a risk in itself, isn't it? And it's that real challenge. And I think we probably get into trouble, don't we, when we try and orchestrate or make the kind of thing that, and again, in Abraham's story we see that, don't we, those moments where he tries to do that and actually he's got to get back on the path of, okay, God, if you've said it, we're gonna see it. And it's trusting God in that process, isn't it? And just knowing, okay, eventually, God, one day if you said it, this thing's gonna happen. And it's a big risk to take, but it's so worth it, right? The reward's there on the other side.
How would you maybe this is the last thing we'll talk about, but would you have any advice for people today who were maybe thinking about, okay, I remember that thing, someone prayed that over me years ago, or I remember I was reading my Bible and this thing stuck out to me, I really felt God speak to me about it. Those kind of long-term things that we feel like God's promised but we've not seen it yet. What would your encouragement today be to someone who said, I've got this thing, I've not seen it yet, but I believe it's going to come?
Well, I think a great starting point is even just in your e-group, just sharing it, like saying, this is a dream that I've had as a young child, or this is a prophetic word that I've had, I've not yet seen it and I really want to see it. I think sometimes we need each other whenever it comes to faith. We need other people to help us to believe. The father with his son, he wanted to believe, but he said to Jesus, help my unbelief. And our role is not to make things happen. It's just simply to believe what God has said. If God has said it, it's not to frustrate you. It's not to dangle a carrot that you chase all the time, but it's actually because it's an invitation for a greater reality. And we do live in the tension of the reality of what we see, but then then there's the reality of what God has promised. And risk is what creates that pathway going from one to the other. But sometimes it's as simple as the next step is just sharing it in your e-group, telling people, being vulnerable. I actually went after this. I didn't see it happen. It really hurt. But I believe it's from God. Would you help me? Would you partner with me on going on this journey to see God's promises, the reward that he has got for me? I think is a great starting point.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. I think you've got a brilliant little something to be discussing now. Those kind of things, maybe there is something that, as we've been talking in this session, you're like, oh, I remembered that thing, or I remember that moment God said that. I remember this moment someone prayed for me about this certain thing, but I've not yet seen it. That risk for you in 2025 could be saying, I'm going to go after that again. God's got it for me. I believe we're going to see it. And so why don't tonight you take that first little step of that risk and share with your e-group, this is what I'm talking about. This is what it's all about. Enjoy your discussion tonight. We'll be back for one more discussion next week. Have a brilliant evening.